Today I'm going to share with you some of the cities and countries where you can lower your cost of living and get a better value for a place to live. And I'm also going to expose you to my thought process for how to save money living overseas without compromising your lifestyle. So I came across a great graph from one of my favorite websites called Visual Capitalist, and it talks about cost of living in the world, basically cost of living versus purchasing power, and they compare this to Numbio's numbers that use New York as the baseline of 100. We've talked about this before. We've talked about the most expensive places to live. We've talked about the cheapest places to live. But what this focuses on is basically value for money. And it tells you what we talk about, how to arbitrage the money you make in a different country, how to live somewhere else, potentially lower your taxes, and lower your cost of living relative to the value that you get. And so we're going to walk through this and explain exactly how you can do that. If it's your first time here, I'm Andrew Henderson, founder of Nomad Capitalist. We're a boutique consulting firm that helps 7- and 8-figure entrepreneurs and investors legally go where you're treated best, which means getting more value for your money, from lower taxes to more freedom to living in places that treat you better. You can learn more at nomadcapitalist.com. And so my thought on cost of living versus purchasing power is there's a couple different levels. Okay, most people are at level 0. Right, which is you are living where you were born. Not only just your country, but you're kind of born in one city and just kind of hang out there, right? You're not really thinking very intentionally. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. There are people I know who have never left Cleveland, Ohio, and they are there 37 years later, and that's level 0 in my opinion. You just haven't given any thought to like where you want to go. What you have right now is a lot of folks who are at level 1, which is that you are living within your own framework, your own construct of a country. I'm an American, I live in the United States, there's nowhere else to go, but hey, I want lower costs. Or hey, I want more freedom because New York City, everything closed down, and Florida or Texas were wide open, I can lower my state taxes, just costs less to live there. So you move to New York to Houston, that's level 1. You're thinking intentionally, but within the framework that makes sense to the average person. Level 2 is you want to move outside of your framework. So we're going to forget the construct of your country for a moment and say, hey, if I can do the job remotely, or if I can run my business remotely, like why not do that in Guadalajara versus Houston, right? So now we're kind of outside of the construct of your country. That's level 2. For me, level 3 is something that I'm personally working on, which is intentionally choosing a framework of fair costs and reasonable taxes to maximize net income while maintaining lifestyle. And so this could be an example of, hey, I want to move to Dublin, Ireland, because I can get a good deal on taxes there, and even though my taxes are going to be higher than if I'm living in Dubai or living in Malaysia or living my trifecta lifestyle, I can live there and I can control my tax expense as a foreigner, and the quality of life and what I'm getting there is going to be worth the trade-off, because if you're making, let's say you make $10 million a year and your tax bill is $100,000, that's probably a fair trade-off for a place that you view as a higher quality of life. And is the incremental expense going to be worth it? And so when I say create a framework of fair costs and reasonable taxes, right? If you can control the tax expense through a lump sum program or a non-dom program in a more developed country, if that's the kind of place that you want to live, you're going to create a quality of life that you're more likely to stick to, therefore driving net income gains longer. And so, for me, I was in Dublin about a year ago, and I said, hey, this isn't actually any more expensive than living in Montenegro next to the yacht club. And so if I live in Montenegro, I want to live next to the yacht club, so I have the kind of services that I want, and yet I can live in a more developed place. I can pay marginally more in taxes, which you don't see. And so it's kind of just creating a fair cost scenario. If you're an IT worker and you're living in Tbilisi right now, let's say you make $150,000 a year and you're using the 1% tax incentive that Georgia has for people who live there full-time and bring in money from somewhere else, you are seeing your rents going up because you have lots of Russians moving to Georgia, and you see expats who are saying, this isn't any better than living in Bratislava or Budapest or Brno. I might as well go to Central Europe. Maybe I'll get a digital nomad visa. Maybe I'll move around and control my tax exposure. And so I would rather have the marginal increase in lifestyle because costs here are rising too quickly. And so level 3 is the one that I want you to think about, where it's like, how do I get a fair return for what I'm putting in? For me, right, the more you make, the more successful you are. And for me, the more I've traveled around and seen the opportunities in the world, it's like, all right, I'd like to move a little bit up the development food chain. And so that's what level 3 is about. And so how do we do that, right? Let's look at this chart from Visual Capitalist. If you're living in Beirut, your cost of living is 120.5. So it's 20% more expensive than New York. Your purchasing power is 15.4. So that's like really terrible. Now, imagine that you lived in Beirut And somehow, obviously, there are challenges in some countries where the electricity goes out or whatever. It's just hard to kind of be connected and be competitive in the global world. But imagine you could create some kind of offshore income that's detached from Lebanon, and you just want to live in Lebanon because that was the quality of life that you wanted. And you could create purchasing power of 1,000 because you had money earned somewhere else using skills that were internationally valuable. Suddenly, the 120.5 wouldn't be that big of an issue, so long as you could be lightly taxed on that, which I think in Lebanon is somewhat difficult. And so for me, the main benefit historically of having a passport like the US passport is that you have the ability to get a job there, right? People in Lebanon might want to get a job in the United States, and even though they know they're not going to save a lot of money because the higher cost of living, which again, I mean, more expensive than New York, but the higher cost of living combined with the high taxes, and they're basically probably not going to save a lot of money unless they live really, really frugally. Hey, at least I can get jobs that pay a lot more, and I can have a higher quality of life than I would here because my purchasing power in Lebanon is so low. Now, the fact that many countries hire remotely, they hire anyone, like it doesn't really matter as long as you can do the job, right? I could probably get plenty of jobs with U.S. companies or plenty of freelance projects or whatever that would pay me a U.S. level wage or something close to it, even though I don't live in the U.S. And so the whole paradigm of what passport you have outside of like living in a Gulf country where they literally have a pecking order and they pay you based on your passport, it really doesn't matter anymore. And so the ability to arbitrage making money somewhere else and then bringing it somewhere is better. Look at Nassau, Bahamas, for example. Nassau, Bahamas is 149 cost of living, 49% more expensive than New York City, and that the purchasing power is 20% less, you're 79.4. Yet how many wealthy people live in the Bahamas because they're at level 3? They're saying, let me intentionally create a framework of fair costs. I make $10 million a year, so the fact that it's 50% more than New York City and the import duties and everything is expensive, I don't really care. You're probably not living in Nassau if you make $10 million a year, but you're living somewhere in the Bahamas. And so the tax savings they have drives it substantially because living in New York City, even though it's 49% cheaper than living in Nassau, Bahamas, you're going to have huge, insane taxes on your high income, and so you'd rather go to places with lower purchasing power because you're bringing your income from overseas, and so you can arbitrage that. And so this is the power of choosing places, not just because they're cheaper, but because you can bring in a higher level of income and get the quality of life that you want. Let's look at places in southern Spain, for example, Granada, Alicante, for example, or others. 51-ish on the living, so it's about half the price of living in New York, and you are making about 80 cents on the dollar. And so the taxes in Spain, not necessarily the best deal, even their tax incentive is not really that good compared to most of those in Europe, but you're dramatically cutting your cost of living. And so again, even if you're earning money there, maybe you're doing better than most people in the world. But if you're earning money from somewhere else, then you're doing a better job. For me, a better example is Cyberjaya, Malaysia, where it is a quarter of the cost of New York City. And you have purchasing power of 128.5. So you have more purchasing power. And so imagine you went to tax-friendly Malaysia, where you could ostensibly have very nominal, if any, tax liabilities, and you could live for 75% less than New York City. Now, KL, Kuala Lumpur, is going to be a little bit more, but you are right out of the box getting a better deal because you've whacked your tax expense and you're getting much better purchasing power on a local basis than you would somewhere else. And so you can look at a city like Seattle, for example. Yeah, it's 12% cheaper than New York, and you have 45% more purchasing power. San Francisco, 6% cheaper than New York, 33% more purchasing power. So you'd say, oh, okay, that's maybe a better deal than living in New York City. But then you look at, well, why couldn't I live if I'm pretty well off? Why couldn't I live in Lausanne, Switzerland, or Zurich, Switzerland, or somewhere? Okay, Zurich, you can't take advantage of the lump sum program, but you could live in somewhere in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, and you would maybe pay 20% more, but you'd have a dramatic savings in taxes, which this does not even take into account, but you'd also have more purchasing power. So 127 purchasing power versus 122 lifestyle power. That's how you can increase not only your purchasing power in these crazy times of high inflation. By the way, Swiss inflation is some of the lowest in the world. You want to look at and it's kind of a fun chart to play with, and figure out where can I go and maximize purchasing power, lower cost of living within the same framework, right? Yes, a place like aforementioned Dublin, Ireland is going to have a higher cost of living. If that gives you a fair trade-off because you can lower the tax costs and you can get more for whatever money that you're bringing in, that is going to be a better deal than living in a place like where you're living right now with no tax incentive, with costs going through the roof. And so for me, Level 3, focus on being in level 3. The intentionality of how do I get a fair return? I'm not trying to lower my costs as low as possible. I'm not trying to go to Kabul. That's what people who want to criticize go where you're treated best say. Oh, you just go to Kabul if you don't like, go to Somalia if you don't like it. Well, no, you don't have to, because the goal is, how do I bring in my money to be lightly taxed? How do I, again, get the best spread on those two? So if you want to go to Addis Ababa, you can, right? Purchasing power there is 9.8, cost of living is 50% less. That's a bad deal if you live there, and it's probably a bad deal for all of us, right? But focus on those numbers, focus on level 3, be intentional. What's the best deal for me? And you'll get a better deal for your family. You can put more money away, you can build more wealth, and you'll be happier.